Hi everyone, welcome back to CNM Glass. My name is Melanie Grant and this is our Coding Clinic review for learning modules 1 through 5 on 2011 specifics. So, two things that we wanted to address in some of our coding clinics that have been brought up during the last couple of weeks. Now, I will say that attendance has been a little small, so we haven't had a whole lot of questions going into ICD-10, but there have been some about formatting in the books, how we're reading it, how it works with our Connect access, and where the gosh darn place do I find the excludes notes with some of these exercises. So I wanted to take a moment to just kind of go over that with you guys and just remind you that you can come in at any time or ask me questions directly to get help in looking at some of these one-on-one. Okay, so let's look at this. The first thing I want to point out is I'm using the 2019 Expert Edition of ICD-10-CM from AAPC. So I'm going to reference some of those page numbers. If you have a different edition than this one, feel free to use yours and try to follow along with the terminology rather than the page. So the first thing is, if you haven't done so already, there's all these really great tabs in the front of the book, and they help you to navigate between the book. Now, me personally, I carry all of my books because I teach multiple classes, and that's a lot of books. I like to put them in a rollaway suitcase, which means these tabs on the side can get a little squished if I have too many. So I try to keep it down to just the ones that are most important. I identify where are my guidelines, where is my illustrations, where's my alpha index, where's my neoplasm table, my table of drugs, external cause index, and the tabular list. Because each of those is its own entity and things that are easier to reference if I can just flip to it. But when it comes to alphabeticals and looking at the different sections of the tabular list, I don't like to keep all of those on here. Now, in your tabular, you do have the colors that identify the different sections within your ICD-10-CM. And so that's all of these colors on the edge of the page that I'm referring to. That helps to identify the different areas, but it should really be based off of you on how to tab the book. Now, in our guidelines section, we have 3 different sections of guidelines, and we've been looking at those very much in detail. We looked at those in 1015 as well, and so we're continuing to go through those as we apply them to specifics in ICD-10-CM coding. Make sure if you get lost on those, you can use the online version, which has a search function. I find that's very helpful because I could be flipping through these every day looking for something. You do have information on risk adjustment, which you just did a report on, and hopefully we're able to find everything that you wanted in here. Anatomical illustrations, and then we get to our alphabetical. Now, rule number 1, never code from the alphabetical. When you're looking for terms, one of the things I can say about the formatting is to always think of the action word. I had a few questions about how do I find the main term? Well, your main term is the action, okay? So you remember, action is referring to what type of coding system you're in and what is our purpose for coding, excuse me. In the case with ICD-10-CM, you want to remember this is your diagnosis. So when you have a long detailed diagnosis, your action word or your main term is the actual problem. Okay, what is the underlying problem that's going on today? So if a patient comes in with a displaced, let's say, a displaced green stick fracture, the actual problem is the fracture. Displaced describes what type of fracture. Green stick describes the type of fracture. And so if you remember those word trees, everybody groaned, I heard it. I heard it. When you think about what is your main term, it's the first thing that you would have in a word tree. Okay, so you have a fracture that is displaced, and that is a green stick. Okay, and maybe even further information of the leg, and then we would break that down further and say it's the left leg and say that it is the femur. And you could break that down further and say what part of the femur, and so we'd say upper end. And all of this information in this fun little word tree is part of your diagnosis, and this is how you find your diagnosis, okay? So if you think about looking at your diagnoses and your words in your services, like the English language found in the medical language, it will help you. So your action is your problem. Always, what is the underlying issue? It's not the fact that there's a green stick. That by itself doesn't make sense. Displaced what? Oh, my problem is my leg. Well, technically, yes, but you're not going to find leg necessarily. There are going to be times where the alphabetical will direct you and give you options under the anatomical location. And so sometimes it is good to start with either fracture or leg. But when you're talking about the main term, you're going again to what is the problem. Can I say that there's a problem here from any single word by itself? And when I say in each of these, I say green stick is not a problem. Green stick is a type of fracture. Displaced is not a problem, although it can be. In this case, it's not. Leg by itself, well, the leg doesn't tell me anything. Left doesn't tell me anything. Femur doesn't tell me anything. And upper end does not tell me anything. So the only thing here that tells me the problem that by itself can say, oh, that's a diagnosis, is a fracture. And all of this information helps to identify the type of fracture. So when we're looking at main terms, make sure you're looking at that. Now, another thing that I've had a lot of questions on is reading the actual tabular, finding things like excludes notes. Man, who's had some trouble with their excludes notes on the questions in your Connect? Well, I know it was confusing for me when I looked at it the first time and I said, wait a second, what are they talking about? Oh, wait. Number one rule that I always yell at myself, always read up and down. So when we start at our coding, you may have noticed this. One of the things I do every time I take you into a code to look up is we start by looking at the category itself and the section that that category is in. And so that section is identified by the very first page of the tabular that is for the section that those codes are in, or that color. So if I'm looking at code for B08.1, that's in the certain infectious and parasitic diseases, or at the top of my ICD-10-CM book, that's classified as what they call Chapter 1. And because we're dealing with textbooks and coding books, I always say coding chapter. In here it just says chapter, but we're talking about the coding book. So code book Chapter 1 for infectious diseases and parasitic. So if I'm looking at B08.1, I say, this is part of Chapter 1. What are the notes for Chapter 1? And I want to go to the very front of that section before I even look at my category. The very front of that section says certain infectious and parasitic diseases for codes A00 through B99. And it has some includes as well as excludes notes here that apply to everything from A00 through B99. So before I look at my code B08.1, I have to look here first. And I see that B08.1 does have an includes note. It does have an excludes 1 and an excludes 2 note. Those should both help me in identifying the proper code for my services, or at least identifying things that do not apply. It tells me also the blocks, and so the next step after I go here, let's say there weren't excludes notes, the next step is to determine where is the block for B08.1. Well, it falls under block for B00 through B09, and I'm looking on page 443 of my textbook, of my coding book, ICD-10-CM. Okay, so the chapter contains the following blocks, and I remember my code B08 falls under B00 through B09. Okay, so I'm gonna write some of this up here for you. We have our chapter page, which has our chapter heading. And here you find notes, includes and excludes one or two as applicable. Okay, so if we look at our chapter page, this is the first place we should look, is under the heading, which has the code range, including your code. So anytime there's a code range that includes your code in a heading, that means everything about that heading applies. Then we have chapter blocks. And what this does is it tells us where to find code ranges for your categories. Okay, and so B08 through B09 is viral infections categorized by skin and mucous membrane lesions. So it's important to read that and say, does that block apply to my code? Okay. On B08.1, I didn't give an example, but this would be for Molluscum contagiosum. Ooh, that's a nasty little bug. And that is a viral. So you would say, yeah, that does apply to my code. If you didn't know, you would want to look it up. And that's another thing I can't stress enough. Look everything up if you don't know it. Okay, so always look up. Any definition. And one key piece of advice I can give to you, Google is your friend, but never marry her or him. Meaning that you can Google things and find information about your codes. You may even find a full code that matches the description that you have, but never marry that code. Always look it up in your tabular, always look up your definitions, and always understand your code as best as you can. Okay, so kind of going back, that was just like a little detour for a second. So our chapter page, our heading, code range, this is where we find notes, includes, and excludes notes. And then we find where is the block for the code that we have. We find the code range for that category. So B08.1 falls under B00 through B09. We've established that, but the thing we have to keep in mind is we have to look at that code range. So I'm going to go to B00 through B09, meaning I'm going to go to the front of B00. Okay? And sometimes this is going to be relevant. Other times it's going to be, okay, well, that was nice. But always read up and down. So when I go to B08 and I find the code range or the block for the code range that it's under at the beginning of B00, underneath there is no additional notes. But sometimes it may include notes, includes, and excludes. So if you're missing these, look here. Look at your code ranges for the code block at the very beginning and say, what is the code, what is the first section, and is there any notes, includes, or excludes notes? Look at the chapter page in the very beginning of the section and say, is there any notes, includes, or excludes notes? And then, we're not done yet. Then we go to our category. Okay, so under our category for B08.1 is the first 3 digits of any code. That's always your category code, is the first 3 digits. And under B08s, it is indicated as other viral infections and categorized by skin and mucous membrane. Lesions not elsewhere classified. Always be wary about that unless you were looking at that codes for a specific purpose. It does have an excludes 1 note. Okay, so again, here's the third place you may find notes, includes, and excludes notes. Okay, and then last but not least, you get to your subcategory. And this is digits anywhere from 4 through 7, which again may include notes, includes, and excludes notes. Okay, so that's a lot of places that you can look. It seems tedious, and yes, it will be at first, but when you get in the habit of doing this, it will help you to select the proper code. It will help you identify areas that are being coded incorrectly. It will show you when you're supposed to have use others, such as primary diagnoses codes that must be listed with anything in a section. And as we look into our week 6 and 7, when we're talking about external factors and injury codes, it's really going to be important because this is going to be places you'll find your 7th digit characters as well. So that's all that I have for today from our coding clinics, learning modules 1 through 5. We haven't had a whole lot of attendance, and I'm hoping to see more of you soon, or see more of you as one-on-one meetings and emails, of course. If you have any other questions, or until next time, please let me know. We'll talk to you soon.